When Juergen Harksen arrived in South Africa, he was a fugitive from the law in Germany. Harksen had managed to steal 750 million rand from hundreds of people who'd invested in a bogus scheme he'd dreamt up. In 1993, his German dream turned sour. Harksen started moving his stolen millions from his German bank accounts. A police informant tipped him off that the authorities were preparing to raid his properties and arrest him. Overnight, Harksen fled to London and from there to South Africa. Here in South Africa, Harksen and his wife Jeanette would continue their fraudulent dealings for another 8 years, stealing another 100 million rand. On their arrival in South Africa, Harksen and Jeanette bought one of the best houses in one of the best suburbs. They threw extravagant parties and drove luxury cars. To the press, they seemed an ordinary, if extremely rich, happy family. But there was nothing ordinary about them. Juergen Harksen had masterminded an extraordinary scam that had allowed them to become very, very rich on other people's money. The scam revolved around an investment that existed in his mind only.
The real version, the sort of that you only got once you were in the closer circle with him and you were seriously thinking about investing big money, was that all the money, the important money, hundreds of millions, actually more than 1 billion marks, was made with oil speculation in a Norwegian fjord.
We'd say to people that he has a share in this big investment, which is controlled by certain trustees, and that his share of that was 1.83 billion Deutsche Mark, and that it was about to pay out. And pending that payment out, if you would give him 1 million Deutsche Mark, he'd pay you 13 million.
Jeanette Harksen and Juergen Harksen have never worked a day in their lives, unless you count their very, very industrious activities in persuading people to part with their money as work, which is work in a way, of course, but it's not honest work. So everything they have is stolen.
There is no investment. We're quite convinced about that. There is no investment.
If it wouldn't be sad that people lose their money, you would actually have to laugh. In a way, this whole thing is like a criminal comedy.
On arrival, Juergen Harksen opened a South African office of his so-called investment company. He spoke eloquently about Scan 1000, his non-existent investment scheme. In this luxurious office, he lived the fantasy of the successful financier. He wooed new clients and received the many Germans who started coming to South Africa to find out what was going on with their money. Harksen was back in the swing of his criminal ways, getting people to believe in the unbelievable. In this way, he would make a further 100 million rand in South Africa.
Harksen recognized 2 human frailties. The first one was greed, and the second is fear. And the one inevitably led to the next. So he would exploit people's desire to make a quick buck.
Not only old creditors of his, German investors, but a lot of South African people have parted with many, many millions of rands whilst he has been in this country.
And they kept coming back and investing more. They'd walk into a room. Harksen would tell them, they would walk into a room deciding that they would not leave there without their money. And they'd leave there just having pledged another million.
Harksen's strongest weapon is his ability to tell lies with utter conviction. This is a video he made of himself to send to nervous German investors.
Ich werde entweder persönlich mehrere Banker vorladen, die Banker, die das Vermögen verwalten. Ich werde möglicherweise...
Kommen die aus aller Welt, oder?
Aus aller Welt, ja.
Aus welchen Ländern?
Das ist jetzt egal, aber sie kommen aus aller Welt. Ich werde meine Trustees möglicherweise vorladen. Viele behaupten ja, dass es meine Trustees nicht gibt, aber das wird dann eben bewiesen, dass es sie gibt. Ich will endlich meinen Frieden wieder haben. Ich will mein Versprechen einlösen. Ich will beweisen, dass ich, wenn überhaupt mir ein Titel zusteht, dann, dass ich ein vernünftiger Finanzkaufmann gewesen bin und dass ich mein Versprechen erfüllt habe.
Shirley and Antoni Karstens are 2 South Africans who fell for his devious charm. They not only handed over 2.5 million rands to him. Antonie also became Harksen's best friend.
You know, we spent a lot of time together. At the height of our relationship, we had breakfast, lunch and dinner together most of the time, so much so that my wife almost became jealous of our relationship because I spent probably more time with him than what I spent at home.
I always had a feeling deep down that something was not right with this man.
But he always got someone or one of his lawyers or advocates to confirm what he'd said. And because he's, he's very clever, that you can never really, you know that he's lying, but you haven't got enough evidence just to confront him with that. And we probably, towards the end of last year, we realized that this is not going to happen.
We were the ones that were taken for a ride by a very clever con man.
Now the question is
In 1994, some of his German investors came to the same conclusion. They were tired of his promises. They turned to the law in South Africa to try and force Harksen to give them at least some of their money back. Harksen used extensive stalling tactics, but was finally declared insolvent. Bernard Kurtz was joined by 2 trustees of Harksen's insolvent estate. Together they started hunting for Harksen's money. They believed that everything he owned was stolen.
There was a strategic decision taken that Harksen, instead of fighting against 200 creditors, would rather fight against 2 trustees. And there were various other benefits for him by going into sequestration. One of them was that he could always say to creditors, well, look, I can't pay out.
In 1998, the trustees had their first big success when they searched his Constantia mansion. This is a police video of the search and seize operation. On this day, the trustees found more than 6 million rand cash, all in foreign notes. They also seized jewelry and other valuables. The trustees had finally proved that Mr. Harksen, the insolvent, was hiding his millions.
97,000 Deutschmark.
Harksen spent much time and effort making the incredible seem true. One of his methods was to surround himself with respectable professionals, like lawyers and accountants. He had 2 legal problems. On the one hand, he was fighting extradition to Germany. On the other, he was fighting the trustees of his insolvent estate. In his 8 years in South Africa, Harksen's lawyers went to court more than 100 times, bringing high court applications, challenging judgments, seeking technical loopholes. It was all about buying time.
In terms of money spent on these attorneys, our conservative estimates are that these exceed 30 million, and we think it's more in the region of 50 million that have been spent.
This was Harksen at his most impressive, emerging from yet another court hearing, smiling, confident, with his lawyer at his side answering journalists' questions.
On bail, pending,
That £1 million bail is
still standing.
Yeah, I see.
He used many attorneys, some of them directly, some of them indirectly. He used many advocates as well. In the past 8 years, he has used more than 7 law firms and more than 50 advocates in Cape Town.
Harksen was an insolvent. He was therefore not supposed to have any money. But in their 1998 raid on his house, police unearthed millions. The trustees believed that Harksen was laundering much of this cash through trust accounts held by various Cape Town law firms.
At various times, various attorneys acted, as it were, as the banker, in the sense that the monies would be received by them, in many cases in foreign currency, Deutsche Mark, US dollars, very often just people walking in and paying 100,000 Deutsche Mark or $50,000, and this being receipted, being credited to a trust account in the name of a third party.
Everyone who took money from Harksen should have been very careful to do a very, very careful investigation as to the source of those funds before they were prepared to accept them.
Because we knew there were millions, and everybody knew that there were millions and millions being paid to these attorneys and advocates. We advised them to check where their money was coming from.
Martin Weltz is the editor of Noseweek, South Africa's only investigative magazine. He's also a lawyer who's written extensively about Harksen and his lawyers.
It seems, in fact, lawyers are the only licensed receivers of stolen goods in our society. And certain of them make a specialty of it.
Paul Katzeff was one of the first lawyers to act for Harksen. During this time, more than 18 million rand used for Harksen flowed through trust accounts held by his firm. He says the money came from backers.
And yes, we've been very circumspect to ensure that those monies were not monies of Mr. Harksen's, belonging to Mr. Harksen. In this regard, we have written statements from various businessmen and lawyers abroad who confirmed to us that the monies paid into our trust account are not monies that have anything to do with Mr. Harksen.
However, it seems that in at least some cases, Harksen created bogus documents. The aim was to convince lawyers that the money was coming from third parties. In an affidavit, a former secretary of Harksen says she saw him do this.
In 1999 and 2000, there was some over 40 million rand was brought into South Africa for Harksen as new sort of investments. They were coloured as being something else, as legal fees and that sort of thing.
This is Mr. Reed Corrin, consulting with his client, Mrs. Harksen. He stopped acting for her shortly after her arrest this year. From 1997, for a 2-year period, more than 8 million rand for the Harksens was processed through trust accounts administered by Corrin. Corrin says he never received any money from Mr. Harksen or held funds on his behalf. However, this list of expenses in Jeanette Harksen's hand shows huge amounts of cash were paid to Corrin and other lawyers. A former Harksen secretary says in an affidavit that she personally took 100,000 Deutschmarks to Corrin's office. Corrin denies this. The question to those around Harksen is how much did they know? No one knew more than this man, Advocate Johan van der Berg, senior counsel and former member of the Cape Bar, once an acting judge and long-standing Harksen legal advisor. Van der Berg made millions representing Harksen. This is his award-winning wine farm, where he makes South Africa's champion Pinotage. At the Desai Commission of Inquiry, Harksen says he paid 15 million rand for a share in Groene Kloof. Van der Berg denies this. Van der Berg says in a letter to Special Assignment that he was always paid in accordance with normal legal practices. There was a time when Harksen paid Van der Berg a monthly retainer of 150,000 rand.
That's a retainer. And that's whether you work or don't work. Now, when that sort of money is being paid, you can imagine when he's got 10 senior counsel employed from time to time on various matters, on matters which are complex and take a long time in court, you can imagine the amount of money that will be spent in that time.
Antoni Karsten says he would never have invested 2.5 million rand with Harksen if Van der Berg had not made him believe that it was safe to do so.
There's a senior advocate that confirmed most of the stuff. And if it wasn't for him, I would never have invested.
And he actually said to me, come with me and let this lawyer confirm what I have just said. And he took me downstairs to the lawyer and sort of put across to the lawyer that I was very insecure about what was happening. And this lawyer told me that everything was fine, that everything was still on track, and that everything was still going to be happening.
This year, the relationship between Karstens and Harksen soured. They called for a meeting at the Cape Grace Hotel to resolve their dispute. Karstens recorded the conversation. Johan van der Berg was also present. On tape, Harksen says van der Berg knows of certain false documents.
I think as a secretary, you also find that you've only got 20% of information. And I think if you know the rest...
So he knows about the falsified papers. You know all about what? You know about the falsified, the fucking shit. You know all.
But there's other stuff as well.
Van der Berg denies in a letter to Special Assignment that he knew of falsified documents. But how is it possible then that a senior advocate with extensive legal experience could have taken this document seriously? This, according to Mr. van der Berg, is a letter of credit that he received from Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the world's leading banks. It purports to mandate him to pay out more than $44 billion to Harksen's creditors. It takes a simple internet search to know that if Juergen Harksen held $44 billion in a bank, it would have made him the second richest man in the world, after American tycoon Bill Gates. Van der Berg seemed to believe this, despite the fact that his client was an insolvent fugitive. Of course, the letter is, like many others, a fake. It was printed in Harksen's office and signed by, among others, his wife Jeanette. One of the witnesses is none other than Ken Kercheval, the name of an actor in the Dallas television series.
The fraudulent documentation is very poorly prepared. It is not convincing at all. And it is astounding that so many people, so many professional people, and I'm now talking about bankers, I'm talking about professional business people in Germany, were conned by this, we were taken in by this documentation. And even more astounded that his attorneys and counsel and people around him, in looking at this stuff, had no reason to doubt.
Van der Berg wouldn't appear on camera, but said to us, "Harksen misled me. He probably did abuse my reputation to legitimize himself. I regret the situation."
Anyone with a modicum of intelligence who actually goes into just some of Mr. Harksen's history has no doubt he's a crook. And yet, Mr. Van der Berg, who's been around with him on intimate terms for 5 years now, going on 5 years, tells us we must excuse him because he was naive and was seduced.
But look at this letter, dictated and signed by Johan van der Berg. It's addressed to a Walter Shipley, supposedly the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. Van der Berg tells Shipley of a meeting he's just had in the Bay Hotel with another Cape Town lawyer and one Lars Peter, a Harksen business associate. Lars Peter doesn't exist. In fact, his role was played by Cape Town photographer Walter Ferrier. In his letter to Shipley, Van der Berg says that they are waiting for a Sue Allen to arrive in Cape Town. Sue Allen doesn't exist either. She's a character in Dallas. This letter, police say, was faxed to Harksen's home. There are a number of other letters like this.
The most significant is the last paragraph. I'm particularly concerned, he says, about the health of Lars Peter, and would also like to put his mind at rest. Lars Peter, of course, being the trustee, being the actor sitting next to him, paid to dodder patiently for the moment. Mr. Van der Berg allowed himself to be trotted out as one of the props that Mr. Harksen used to persuade innocents about his credibility.
The plot thickens. On the 30th of June 2001, Cape Town attorney and notary Jan Trieter, also present at the Bay Hotel meeting, drew up a collation certificate. He verifies the identity of Glenn Goldstein, executive vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank, through his American passport. Trieter then states that the letter of credit is a true copy of the original. We know that the letter of credit is forged. Glenn Goldstein is indeed the vice president of Chase Manhattan, but he never set foot in South Africa, and certainly did not appear before Mr. Trieter. What steps did Trieter take to make sure that his Mr. Goldstein was indeed the Chase Manhattan banker? What role did advocate Johan van der Berg play in convincing Trieter of the authenticity of Goldstein and the letter of credit? Trieter wouldn't tell us, except that he had met a Glenn Goldstein who identified himself through his American passport. The rest of the information, Trieter says, is privileged. Harksen used the collation certificate and the involvement of advocate Johan van der Berg to extort further money from investors. Van der Berg says he only recently discovered that his involvement was used by Harksen to legitimize his activities. He says he regrets this.
Undoubtedly, Mr. Van der Berg has, his relationship has become what I would call seriously improper. He apologizes sometimes for it, but there is actually no apologizing to be done. The fact is that Mr. Van der Berg was obviously so attracted by the money that he became increasingly involved.
Advocate Van der Berg was to have received $22 million in fees for overseeing the payout to creditors. This is an application to open an account at Chase Manhattan Bank. It bears his signature. This is the check. Both documents are fake. The Director of Public Prosecutions in the Western Cape, Advocate Frank Kahn, today confirmed that he's received a police docket involving Advocate Van der Berg in another Harksen-related matter. He's requested further investigation. Then he will decide whether to prosecute.
We know that there have been dossiers being sat upon, is the word used in our profession, in the Attorney General's office in Cape Town since early this year. And the weeks and the months tick by. Now, whether they're hoping that Mr. Harksen will get deported so that they can then claim they could not successfully prosecute these men with their prime witness gone, I'm saying it is becoming increasingly shocking and disturbing.
Cape Town's full of people tainted by Harksen money. The Desai Commission of Inquiry heard about money given to top politicians in the Democratic Alliance. Harksen told startling tales of how he bought favours and friendship. He denies giving money to the ANC, but there is the story of former ANC security chief Andre Lincoln. Andre Lincoln was once head of Thabo Mbeki's Presidential Investigations Task Unit. He's currently on trial in Cape Town for fraud and theft. This letter was written by Lincoln's boss in the ANC's Department of Intelligence and Security. It's on an ANC letterhead and is addressed to Harksen's lawyer, Kulenkampf. It authorizes Lincoln to accept a loan for 286,000 rand. What did Harksen get in return? This letter, marked secret, shows us. It's from Lincoln to Harksen. Harksen is receiving top-level police intelligence. It's a year later, and Lincoln now works for police crime intelligence. He spies for Harksen and warns him that people are plotting his extradition. He says he's sending a person to Hamburg and Cape Town. He has the cell phone numbers and details of spies. These he will reveal to Harksen. Lincoln says he was only doing an undercover operation, but we know police found at least one receipt for money that Lincoln signed.
That is a matter between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Harksen. We have not received money from Mr. Harksen.
Harksen's money compromised many, but did it compromise our justice system? For 8 years he's managed to frustrate his extradition to Germany. He's also lived the high life as an insolvent while committing ongoing fraud. The trustees say there was enough evidence to arrest Harksen in 1996. Until now, no one has been prepared to prosecute him.
And on each occasion, the trustees were effectively met with a response that these people were too busy. When we found these documents in 1998, we again approached the prosecuting authorities and law enforcement. And again, there was complete apathy.
Mr. Harksen was never immune to prosecution. His extradition was always imminent.
The small man always fears and often perceives, and that is that if you're rich enough, well enough connected, you don't collect the same justice or recrimination from the law as if you are poor and less well connected.
I believe that requires the serious attention of a commission of inquiry, and that commission of inquiry must not just look at, did Mr. Harksen make a donation to the Democratic Party, for example, but they must look at how was it possible for this man to do what he did.
This was the way the Harksen dream began. Family snaps of their early loot in Germany. Today, millions of stolen rands later, their luck is running out. And so might that of those who aided and abetted them.